Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are made by all to improve the lives of everyone that's infected. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and to share your comments with us on Twitter at the Fortune Society SOC. Today's show is entitled Repurposing Closed Prisons to Strengthen Communities. Between 2000 and 2022, 21 states partially closed or fully closed at least one correctional facility and reduced correctional capacity in the United States by 81,441 prison beds, according to a report by the Sentencing Project. For example, in New York State, a closed medium security prison has been repurposed as a movie and TV studio, while in Tennessee, a former maximum security prison has been repurposed as a whiskey distillery and campgrounds. Unfortunately, such projects are more of an exception than the norm. In this episode, we're joined by Senior Director of Advocacy, Nicole D. who discusses how out of step the U.S.'s scale of incarceration is with the rest of the world, and the unacceptable racial bias that dominates criminal legal practices. Nicole D. is the Senior Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project, a Washington, D.C.-based advocate for effective and humane responses to crime that minimizes imprisonment and criminalization of youth and adults by promoting racial, ethnic, economic, and gender justice. At the Sentencing Project, she manages the organization's state and local advocacy efforts on sentencing reform, voting rights, and confronting racial disparities in the criminal legal system. Nicole, thank you so much for joining us today here at Both Sides of the Bars. And after reading the report, I was really fascinated by the report and know that you have taken the time out to look into this issue, which is of extreme importance, and to bring it to the public awareness so as to raise attention and actually have some changes happen. So talk to us a little about this concept, what developed your interest in this issue here, right? 21 states partially closed or fully closed at least one correctional facility in 2000, resulting in repurposing trends. Talk about, one, your interest in this area, and then how this repurposing trend started to develop.
Well, so thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate joining you all and being able to speak to this work. This work is so important. 2023 marks the 50th year of mass incarceration. The Sentencing Project has identified 1973 as the first year that the nation's prison population surged. And currently, over 5 million are under supervision in the criminal legal system. Nearly 2 million are incarcerated in prisons or jails, disproportionately Black. And the current prison rate is much higher, in fact, significantly higher than it was when the prison population started to surge in the early 70s. I mean, in the early 70s, the total number of people in prison and jail was 360,000. So the work to document prison closures and reusing correctional facilities that were built or added to during this era of mass incarceration as in an attempt to stretch the imagination of correctional stakeholders, those who are, working and leading correctional departments, policymakers who are responsible for addressing public safety policy, including correctional policy, and the advocates and organizers working across this country, working to challenge mass incarceration and imagine something different. The purpose of this report and the work that it's built on is to document that in spite of an era of mass incarceration, there are active efforts to decarcerate. Some of those efforts have been successful. And even in places where there continues to be too high levels of incarceration, there's examples of reusing correctional facilities as other community assets outside of the correctional system altogether. So as lawmakers, advocacy organizers, and other stakeholders consider what's possible by decarceration, that they have something to look to. And so that was the purpose of documenting the number of prison closures since 2000 and documenting practical projects that have been completed in some communities and others that are still underway around reusing correctional facilities outside of the prison system and outside of corrections uses.
Totally. And, with the repurposing these repurposing trends, right? And the closure of these facilities, Nicole, what has it done to the population, right? The prison population to begin with in New York City? Has it resulted and yielded in some measure of success? I know there's reported 81,000 or so, or over 80,000 or so. Has it yielded any or pretended some success to some degree with these closures and the amount of people that were released?
So this report and the conversation it's focused on isn't meant to suggest that it's the only solution or it's the only issue that needs to be addressed in challenging mass incarceration. In any state, including New York, which is among states that have had a significant decline in its prison population since the population peaked in the early 2000s, New York has closed several prisons. The people who continue to be incarcerated in New York's correctional facilities are still subjected to outrageous conditions, are still at risk of other outcomes, poor outcomes, because they are incarcerated and because correctional systems are often underfunded. And even when there has been decarceration, the conditions that people continue to be subjected to is outrageous. The reality is in the United States that the correction system became too large. It grew too much, given the scale of incarceration and given the growth in imprisonment since the early 1970s. In fact, over the last 50 years, the scale of incarceration has grown by 500%. It's an outrageous factor. It's an outrageous outcome to public safety practices in this country nationally, and puts the United States out of step with other countries around the world that also had increases in crime, but did not respond to those increases in crime with expanding their prison population and disappearing tens of thousands of individuals to people in prison. So the report does document that because of the closures between 2000 and 2022, over 81,000 beds were taken offline, but that is also happening at a time when mass incarceration is persisting in the United States. And there need to be continued efforts around decarceration, even in New York, where there's been a number of prison closures and state officials have contributed to prison closure efforts and prison closure outcomes. And yet still, there's too many people incarcerated in New York. The impact on families and communities and individuals is persisting. And so there's much more work to do. And hopefully this report helps to stretch the imagination that in the context of decarceration, reusing correctional facilities for other community assets is possible, and it is happening.
Yeah, and so when you talk about that, this notion of reimagining, right, and repurposing, if you take them together, how does that look relative to repurposing prisons for the benefit of the community? Are there some examples that you can give of some prisons or jails being repurposed and how, in fact, that benefited the community in some way? Because in the public mind, many instances, the perception could be that, well, what are you going to close the jail for? You need them to put people in there. Well, how's it going to benefit the community? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think it's important to realize that and it's always important to remember that the United States prison population grew too substantially in the years following 1973, when the prison population started to surge. The U.S. could have responded in a different way rather than expanding prison and jail capacity with the focus of with the focus of disappearing people to incarceration. The U.S. could have responded with an expansion of social services that focused on reducing contact with the criminal legal system as opposed to embracing punitive policies that lengthen prison terms and the likelihood of being sentenced and admitted to prison. So there are real examples of communities reusing closed correctional facilities that should offer if not a blueprint, models or an example of ways to facilitate and explore reusing closed correctional facility. In Lorton, Virginia, where the Washington D prison was cited and closed in the late 90s. That closed prison site has been repurposed for a mixed-use real estate development that includes, I will admit, too high housing that has contributed to a very high cost of housing in the area, but it also includes community space for art and community classes. There is a current prison being redeveloped in the Dallas, Texas area that sits adjacent to green space, and the nonprofit organization anchoring the reuse of that closed prison is working with the community and directly impacted residents to engage community stakeholders around what the reuse of that closed prison site could be, including having community use for directly impacted residents, community space for restorative justice, and other services to meet public safety needs from a community perspective. And you mentioned, as you opened, the site in New York, where a closed prison is being reused as a movie studio. I will say that some of the movies shot at the prison, continue sort of popular perceptions around prison. So movies or TV shows that are set in prisons, filmed at that closed prison site. And then the whiskey distillery that you mentioned in your opening comments also sort of traffics in the fact that the whiskey distillery in concert in public venue space is sitting on top of a closed prison. So the sales and the restaurant and some of the amenities within the site capitalize on the fact that it used to be a prison. I think the conversation for this work is moving into a place to explore the responsibility of prison reuse project managers and developers in continuing to capitalize on closed prisons as, for their marketing potential or for sort of the financial outcomes related to that. And that's because of some of the harm that we know happens behind prison. So people who are engaged in this space have questions, have critiques around, stores capitalizing off of a closed prison, or movie studios, contributing to the popular imagination around what a closed prison or what the United States prison system is, given movies and TV shows that are filmed at closed prison sites. That all said, in spite of any, emerging criticisms or critiques related to reusing closed prisons, from my perspective, if a closed prison does not currently incarcerate someone, if it's closed and its current use is not focused on imprisonment, which can contribute to harm and violence that people are often subjected to behind prison walls, then that is a good step. That is something that communities, that stakeholders should be working towards. And then I think as the conversation continues to develop, making sure that any reuse projects are developed and completed within the best use of the community is also a goal that stakeholders and prison reuse advocates can be targeting and working towards.
And that's a great segue, Nicole. And as we think about what you've done in terms of what you've written in the report, right, and what you've just articulated, I think the question is, if we don't reuse decommission prisons, what might the outcome be if we don't reuse them, right? What could possibly happen?
Well, there's an emerging conversation to sort of bridge movements between the decarceration movement and the immigrant advocacy movement, because what we've seen is a trend to move correctional infrastructure from incarcerating, holding people in custody for one purpose and moving it to another purpose. So, for example, there is a trend where if correctional facilities are not decommissioned, and if a state prison system decides that they could close it, that correctional facility could be sold or reused for correctional purposes. So there's been a movement of correctional capacity between states and the federal government, between localities and states, where where the ownership or the management of the property is transferred to different correctional managers, so that if not state prisoners are incarcerated, their federal prisoners might be.
As we, you mentioned about New York State. I know we're here in New York City. You're in DC. I'm actually here in New York City. And so when we think about New York State, I know there's something that's called the Prison Reuse Commission. Talk a little about what this commission's purpose and aim is, and like, how did it come about?
Well, the aim of the commission was to help guide conversations within the state around the reuse of closed correctional facilities. The governor established the commission, and the commission issued a report last year documenting and helping to identify ways to facilitate prison reuse conversations in communities where prisons were closed. I think it's very much a model for other states that are considering overall conversations, state strategies to close prisons and reuse them for non-correctional uses. There's pending legislation in the state of California that was introduced this year that would establish a prison reuse commission in that state, modeled after New York's reuse commission. I think the commission also helped to monitor and oversee the funds that were distributed in the state of New York to localities and communities for community redevelopment conversations. And I think that information and the work that New York has helped to trailblaze around closing prisons and then planning for their reuse is very important, and is something that I certainly share with colleagues around the country who are interested in seriously considering not just prison closures, but for planning for the future of a community following a prison's closure.
And so, that's some helpful context. And so I'm thinking, as we're talking about this, Nicole, right, in your report, right, there's been some proposed recommendations of some sort. And I'd like to walk through some of those recommendations with you and sharing it with our viewers and listening audience. And if we can walk through them carefully, because they're so significant. As I read them, they resonated with me. And obviously, when we were thinking about reimagining like criminal justice or the criminal legal system in some way, right, I think some of the recommendations jives a lot with the perspective of Fortune and many other advocates who are in the criminal legal system reform movement. So talk to us about the recommendations that came out of this report.
Well, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, again, we're in the 50th year of mass incarceration. So it is critical to continue to support efforts to decarcerate and to address the too high prison population, even in New York, where there has been declines, but there continue to be people who no longer need to be in prison. And I know that there are active efforts to address, to have post-conviction relief for people sentenced to too long prison terms over the last 50 years, people who now have aged into, being elderly, or they're aged into disability, and they may, they should certainly be considered for release. Another key recommendation within the report is to plan for reuse after a prison closed. So the reduction in prison populations and the fact that in some states like New York have actually closed prisons create this opportunity for intentional discussions. Lawmakers, also advocacy organizers who are interested in decarceration and then also interested in advocating for something to work towards should look at prison reuse, should look at decommissioning prisons as an outcome of decarceration and as part of an ongoing agenda to help recalibrate the two large prison systems that have dominated this country for the last 50 years and continue to plague this country, resulting in the disappearing of residents and the significant impact, the collateral impact on families and communities. And there is also a need to prioritize community reinvestment. I think as these conversations move forward and have taken place in New York, a lot of the focus is on what's lost in communities where prisons are closing, there also needs to be focus on where people have been disappeared from, the high incarceration neighborhoods that many people are incarcerated and imprisoned from. So with the freeing up of resources through decarceration, through decommissioning prisons, and finding other community uses for decommissioned prisons, those resources should also be targeted to high incarceration communities, to prioritize resources in communities that have been historically disinvested, where there's chronic low quality housing, there are under-resourced jobs programs, poor outcomes for employment, a lack of living wage employment. So it's not just about where prisons are closing and making the communities where cited prisons are making those communities whole because they were sold a promise during the mass incarceration era around economic development strategies that focused on the disappearing and warehousing of individuals. There should be economic development conversations in those communities, and there must also be economic development conversations in historically disinvested communities that are highly impacted by mass incarceration and over-policing and over-incarceration policies. And lastly, there needs to be continued efforts around improving data and documentation of prison reuse. This is an emerging conversation. I have been very inspired to do this work and to help contribute to documenting this work. I'm being joined now by academics and researchers in university settings from Yale and to Brown University to also UCLA, and welcome, continued partnership with academic partners, as well as continued documentation from state officials and state stakeholders who are looking at prison reuse, looking to decommission prisons, and then also document and report on how decommissioned prisons are being repurposed for non-carceral purposes.
I mean, totally amazing, Nicole. I think that, what you have embarked on, right, as an activist and advocate to highlight these issues is of note, and certainly something that we look to see happen in more conversations, right, around this issue. What's on the horizon, right, for Nicole and her work and her commitment, obviously, to ending mass incarceration? And so talk a little about that as we soon come to a close.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. This year has been an interesting and complicated year, I would say mixed year. We are embarking on how the United States will continue in this era of mass incarceration, and really need to escalate advocacy related to challenging it. So that is why the Sentencing Project has launched a campaign this year to call attention to 50 years of mass incarceration that started in 1973. I think what's next is to continue to shine a light on this failure in U.S. social policy that has worked to disappear tens of millions of individuals behind prison and jail walls, and then also, left to, significantly impact with collateral consequences, not just individuals, but also families and entire communities. So the Sentencing Project is partnering this year with national, state, and local partners to continue to call attention to the 50 years of mass incarceration. This is about a civic engagement project, and hopefully in the work to civically engage folks through this effort to remind people of the 50 years that have currently passed in this era of mass incarceration. It will inspire coalitions, it will inspire state, local, and national conversations to continue to challenge mass incarceration. It's about campaigns, winning campaigns to decarcerate. It's about winning campaigns to challenge the collateral consequences. But it's also about changing the hearts and minds by acknowledging the problem and then stretching imagination for people to be thinking and reorienting what public safety is in this country. And I would hope that the work I've done to document prison closures and also their reuse, particularly for the community assets that build on community, that help to reimagine what needs to come next in community, offer a pathway forward. to challenge mass incarceration, and then to also imagine what can come after decarceration.
Nicole D. Porter, thank you so much, Senior Director of Advocacy at the Sentencing Project. Thank you for all the work that you've done. Thank you for putting out this really important report. And we certainly look forward to having you join us again. And, we want to thank all of you, our viewers, for joining us, right, for this really thought-provoking conversation. In the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you so much for tuning in to Both Sides of the Bars. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please join us, or rather, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org. That's fortunesociety.org. My name is Andre Ward, and we appreciate you for joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.
If you want to know how to reduce crime in America, in New York City, you do it one person at a time, creating an environment that celebrates the human spirit. Recidivism is a result of societal failure to do that. And Fortune has demonstrated that lives can change.
I tell people all the time, this is where I grew up. This is where I learned what being a man is and what being a productive citizen means.
It is the work of this great organization that has helped to shape my ideas, drive my conviction, and further deepen my commitment to the cause.
For more than half a century, you have amplified the voices of those who are impacted by unfair policies and helped thousands of justice-involved people transform their lives. You have led by example to show how we can help formerly incarcerated individuals come home, rebuild their lives, and contribute to our communities.
It's never about the contract or the milestones first. It's always about the individual. These individuals were literally suffering in incarceration because they just didn't have an address to go to. And for them to walk into a place where it's about them and only them and what they need and only what they need.
There's one person in particular, he came through our programs and he ended up opening his own construction company, and he came back to Fortune and said, I want to hire people from here, and it was like about how if you lift one person up, they lift others. Even if it's just one person that this happens to, it's worth it. And I know that it's not just one person, it's many people.